Hi, folks. Today we're going to talk about the issues at stake in the campaign. There are many, everything from Trump's wall to migration, but we're going to concentrate on two today. The first big one, corruption, and then secondly, violence and related to that, security. So in terms of corruption, this is the one that's getting the most press here in Mexico. I read a poll yesterday in La Jornada that said something like 8 out of 10 Mexicans are dissatisfied, unhappy with the government. 35% of people polled identify themselves as anti-sistema, against the system. By that, we don't mean necessarily that they're anti-capitalist or anything like that. They're anti what they see as the system of corruption. So let's start with that, Kurt, in terms of the political implications of this issue of corruption.
Sure. So corruption has been a long-standing problem in Mexico and Latin America, and frankly in the United States and the rest of the world. But in the Peña Nieto administration, what has been an endemic problem has gotten much worse. Peña Nieto came to power pretending that there's going to be a new generation of PRI leaders. They talked about the new PRI, and what's happened is that the new PRI has been even worse than the old PRI with regards to corruption. So that means we're talking about a dozen or more former PRI governors are under investigation, are on the lam, or are in some part of the justice system being accused of corruption, inexplicable enrichment, and nexos with narcotraficos. Peña Nieto himself, during the 2012 election, his campaign was infused with money for vote buying, for direct vote buying through cards, which also came from drug nexus. So this has been an endemic problem. And so López Obrador is really trying to capitalize on this and saying, we're going to clean this up. We're going to clean up corruption at all levels in government. We're going to run an honest, austere Republican government. So take the corruption under Peña Nieto and add to that the average Mexican's frustration with what's called the pharaonic state in Mexico. This is a government of great luxuries and hugely inflated salaries. The president makes something like $15,000 US a month, tax-free. The ministers of the Supreme Court make up to $25,000 US a month. When you compare this to a minimum wage of 90 pesos or about $5 a day. So there's this seething long-term anger in the Mexican population with what they perceive to be this luxury state that lives on the expense of their taxes. And when you add to that, the presidency has a huge budget for publicity and promotion. So the presidency and the other, Congress as well, the Supreme Court, are constantly promoting themselves on television, on radio, on billboards. Peña Nieto purchased a new presidential jet, which is more luxurious than Air Force One. So corruption is a huge, huge issue, and AMLO's main theme is that if we clean up corruption, we'll have enough money for all of its other social spending, which seems also to not be quite the case. Right. There's certainly a lot to be saved there, but it's not quite as simple as that.
Right. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about violence. I mean, there are so many issues around this. There's the question of the relationship between violence and austerity.
Yeah.
There's a question of the relationship, of course, between violence and personal security.
Right.
Big issues like the 43 disappeared students, never been resolved. That's still an open case. Last year, 2017, was a record year in terms of violence, something like 23,000 murders in the country. Since 2007, since the beginning of the drug war, there have been 164,000 murders, not all of them, of course, related to the drug war, but many, many of them. So violence is a huge issue. So let's talk a little bit about that as an issue in the election.
Sure. This is the issue that everybody is talking about. Security, safety. In 2006, after the contested election there, Felipe Calderón, with what I call kind of the illegitimacy complex, launched a drug war, which he'd never mentioned in the campaign, launched a war against drug trafficking, which has lasted ever since then, throughout his 6 years and through Peña Nieto's 6 years. The military out in the streets to supposedly combat drug trafficking with, the result of hundreds of thousands of deaths and really kind of a rending of the social fabric in large parts of the country. This violence has knock-on effects in the sense of journalism, for example. Mexico is now one of the most dangerous countries for journalists, up there with Iraq and Syria. It's the most dangerous non-war zone country for journalists. It's a terrible country for feminicides and violence against women. And this violence has permeated areas of the country which hadn't seen it before. Analysts have said that what was originally a more localized drug problem, there were certain corridors in the country, has basically, they whacked the hornet's nest and has spread out the drug violence to other parts of the country. Now, just recently, the Congress passed a very controversial law called the Internal Security Law, La Ley de Seguridad Interior, which basically allows the Army to take on policing functions within the country, which they've been doing anyway. You know, and if you go to any poor community, they'll tell you they've always been doing it. But now they are legally allowed to take on policing functions. This was a law that was heavily opposed by the United Nations and a lot of institutional as to international organizations. It was passed anyway. And really, all of the candidates on this have a very questionable record. The PRI and the PAN supported the internal security law. The left nominally is against it, but López Obrador basically says, well, I don't need it because I'm going to do it anyway, based on what the Constitution allows me to do as president, to have a mando único, or a unified command of both military and police functions, which is an example of how authoritarian the discourse has become, that all of the major parties have really subscribed to an authoritarian view of how the country needs to be handled. AMLO also talks a little bit about, or a lot, about attacking the causes of violence in poverty and lack of jobs and whatever else, but that doesn't absolve his stance on using the army.
Okay, thanks very much.